Hello to my friends joining us via recording. We are working on lab lesson number 9, which is all about the brain. When we talk about the brain, the first part for us to be aware of is the big part of the brain. So when you think about the brain, what you're probably thinking of is this big pink part up here. So the big pink part that makes up the brain is called the cerebrum. The cerebrum. And that's where all of your higher order functions come from. Different lobes of the cerebrum do different things that make you human. So if we start here with this lobe here in the front, really it's all of this stuff here. All of this is part of the frontal lobe, just like that frontal bone or the frontal region. Back behind the frontal lobe, we have our next lobe, which is called the parietal lobe, where the parietal bones were found. In the back at the bottom of the brain, we have the occipital lobe, the occipital lobe. And on the side of the brain, this one over here is the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe. If we looked deep, so if we took away a little bit of the frontal lobe, a little bit of the parietal lobe, a little bit of the temporal lobe, if we looked deep inside here, we would also see a lobe of the brain called the insula. So the last of the 5 lobes of the brain called the insula that we see there. When we talk about each of these lobes of the brain, each lobe has a slightly different function. So the one lobe in your brain that does motor activities, when you decide to move something, this is also the lobe that helps you with decision making and reasoning. That's the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is your personality, it's your critical thinking skills, it's also how you move. This back lobe is the parietal lobe. This is a sensory lobe. So all of the information from touch, from stretching, from temperature, all of that stuff goes here to the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe primarily helps you with vision. And I think that's kind of funny because that's as far away as possible from the eyeballs. That's where we process visual information, the occipital lobe. Over on the side, we have the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe primarily helps you with hearing, but the temporal lobe also helps some with smell. And the deepest lobe, that one called the insula, that one is important in memories. That one is also important in the sense of taste. So each of the 5 lobes of the brain have slightly different functions. When we talk about the lobes of the brain, or when we talk about the cerebrum in general, there's a couple of words that help us to describe its appearance. So the brain is bumpy. That's because it has ridges that are called gyri. I'll put that in the chat for us here. One of them is called a gyrus. So a gyrus is a bump. We see bumps all over the surface of the cerebrum. And the indentations in between those bumps are called a sulcus. So a sulcus is an indentation, a gyrus is a bump. When we're looking at the brain, there's one really important sulcus for you to make sure you're familiar with. And that's this one that we see right here, where we go from red to blue. This is called the central sulcus, the central sulcus. And it is the indentation, the dividing line between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Notice that this brain flip-flopped from what we were just looking at. So my frontal lobe now on the right side, my parietal lobe now on the left. So the central sulcus divides up the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And the reason we care so much about it is not just because it divides up those lobes, it's also because of the bumps or the gyri that are found right in front of it or right behind it. So right in front of the central sulcus is something called the precentral gyrus, the precentral gyrus. This is the bump right in front of the central sulcus. The precentral gyrus has a motor map of your entire body. So in the lab packet, it's going to say this is the location of the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex, or what we're going to call it in our lecture class when we talk about the brain, is something called the motor homunculus. The motor homunculus, which is a map of your entire body, giving you the ability to choose which parts of your body you're moving. So the precentral gyrus is all about motor functions. The postcentral gyrus, post means after, postcentral gyrus is the bump that we find behind the central sulcus. This one has a map of your body where all of the sensory information goes. So information that you feel with your fingers goes to a different part of this bump compared to your toes or compared to your face. We have a map of your entire body in the postcentral gyrus that allows us to process sensory information. If I'm going to ask you about the central sulcus or the precentral gyrus or the postcentral gyrus, I'm going to use this color-coded model because we can for sure see where those things are. I'll mention that when we go back to this picture, you can actually also see the central sulcus right here. See how we can see this dividing line, which makes this one the precentral gyrus and this one the postcentral gyrus. So when we have a line that goes all the way across from one part of the cerebrum all the way over to the other, that's the central sulcus, and we have the precentral and postcentral gyri on either side. There's one other dividing line for you to be familiar with, and that's the one that we see right here called the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure. A fissure is a really deep sulcus. The longitudinal fissure divides the two hemispheres, or the two halves of the brain. The left and the right side of the brain generally have the same kinds of functions, although there are some things that are done better in the left half of the brain versus the right half of the brain. That's why you'll hear some people say like, oh, I'm really a left brain person or a right brain person, because some of our skills are more useful for one side of our brain versus the other. So left side tends to be things like math. Right side tends to be things artistic, those kinds of things. But generally they do about the same kinds of things. If we look just below the cerebrum, which was what we just talked about, the brain with all of its lobes, we see something called the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is found right underneath the cerebrum. The cerebellum is kind of like a little cerebrum. It has a lot of the same things as the cerebrum did. So the cerebellum is made of two hemispheres, just like the cerebrum was, two halves. Those halves are connected to each other with this structure that I see right here. This little structure is called the vermis. The vermis, it literally means worm. So we've got this little worm-looking thing that connects the two halves of the cerebellum together. When we look inside the cerebellum, you can see this pattern of white that's inside the cerebellum. This is something called the Arbor Vitae. The Arbor Vitae is the tree of life. That's what it means. So the white matter that's in the middle of the cerebellum, that's called the Arbor Vitae. The rest of the cerebellum is made out of gray matter, so it looks darker. And gray matter is gray because it doesn't have as much myelin as white matter does. So gray matter on the outside, white matter on the inside, and we call that white matter the Arbor Vitae. By the way, the cerebellum has gyri and sulci just like the cerebrum did. So all of these little bumps and indentations are gyri and sulci. They're just much more folded than they were with the cerebrum. That allows there to be more neurons. The more folded we are, the more neurons we can have. So when we look at the cerebellum, it actually has just as many neurons in it as the cerebrum does. It's just way smaller because we fold it up really, really tight. For unit number 3, when you're working on current events in anatomy, there are actually a couple of articles about people who were born without a cerebellum and didn't realize they didn't have one till their 20s. So it's possible to live without a cerebellum, but it does lead to some delays in motor functions or in the ability to speak or act. So if you're interested in learning about what it would be like to live without a cerebellum, there are articles that talk about that you could consider. I want to jump ahead with you to this model here. I believe it's on page 5 of your lab packet. Can you all confirm for me, is it page 5 that we see this particular lab model on? Okay, got a couple of us agreeing yes, it is on page 5. So let's go to page 5 of your packet. We're going to label some of the stuff that we've already labeled, and then I'm going to use this model to show you where other things are as well. When I'm looking at this model, the first thing I see is the cerebrum, which was the big part of the brain, right? So we just talked about the cerebrum. And we talked about how the cerebrum has those lobes. So it has the regions that do specific jobs. So here in the front, we've got our frontal lobe. And then more toward the back, we have that parietal lobe, the parietal lobe. And in the very back at the bottom, we've got that occipital lobe. Remember, I can't really see the temporal lobe. I can't see the insula, but those are the ones that I can see. A very important structure, you must know this structure right here, this white matter that I see. This white matter that I see here is called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is an absolutely must know, because this is a structure that connects the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. The ability of the two halves of your brain to talk to each other is because of the corpus callosum. A fun fact about the corpus callosum is that in some people with seizures, we actually cut the corpus callosum, because sometimes seizures are caused by the left side of the brain telling your body to do something and the right side telling it to do something else, and that can lead to a seizure. So the corpus callosum, if I sever that, the left and the right side can't talk to each other, and we can't have that angry seizure. So the corpus callosum, the big band of white matter that connects the two halves of the brain together, on top of, or excuse me, just below the corpus callosum, we see another thin band of white matter. That thin band of white matter is called the fornix. And the fornix is really important in helping us to put memory information deep into our brain, into a region called the hippocampus. So the fornix, my smaller white matter, the corpus callosum, my bigger white matter. The fornix is right on top of something that I think kind of looks like the face of a duck. So we've got a little duck bill over here. See my little duck bill I just added? And we've got this face on the duck. So let's start with the bill of our duck over here. The bill on the duck is something called the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is down below the head of the duck, so my circle region in here. That region is just called the thalamus. So remember that hypo means below. The hypothalamus is below the thalamus. The hypothalamus is really important in regulating a lot of conditions in your body. It does that working with this structure number 16 right here. This structure number 16 that hangs down is something called the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland. And you will talk about the pituitary gland extensively in AMP2. It makes many, many different hormones, many that regulate things like growth or sex hormones, lots of different hormones made by the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland when it should or shouldn't release its hormones. So it regulates the pituitary gland. The thalamus, which was the whole head of the duck, when we think about the thalamus, this is a relay center. So it sorts information to the part of the brain that it's supposed to go to. Or when information comes from all of the places in the brain, it focuses it down so that it can go down the spinal cord. So my thalamus is kind of like a filter or like a relay center. In the very middle of the thalamus, you can see this brown spot, number 8 here. This brown spot number 8 is called the intermediate mass of the thalamus. The intermediate mass of the thalamus. When you think about that, consider it essentially the same kind of thing as the corpus callosum. The intermediate mass connects together the two halves of the thalamus to each other. So the eye of the duck is the intermediate mass, and it's connecting the two halves together to one another. Back behind the duck, one other structure to know, this number 9 structure here, that's something called the pineal gland. The pineal gland. And the pineal gland is the gland that makes melatonin. So melatonin is your sleepy time chemical. When it's close to bedtime, melatonin secretion goes up. When it's time to wake up, melatonin secretion should go down. So the pineal gland there back behind the thalamus makes that hormone melatonin. Then we move down into a part of the brain called the brainstem. I need to erase my thing here. When we think about any of the parts of the brainstem, you should really consider that this is the part of your brain that keeps you alive. So very basic life functions come from the brainstem. So the top part of the brainstem up here, this top part of the brainstem is called the midbrain. The midbrain. Honestly, the only thing you need to know about the midbrain is that on its backside, it has a couple of bumps. Number 18 represents these bumps. So we only care about the midbrain in our class because it has these things called that are the bumps. These bumps are called the corpora quadrigemina. Corpora quadrigemina. And the corpora quadrigemina are responsible for your visual reflexes and your auditory reflexes. So if we were in class together and I picked up a textbook and started to throw it at you, you'd move out of the way. That's because of a visual reflex. So helping us to be aware of what's happening around us, corpora quadrigemina. The other kind of reflex that it helps us with are auditory reflexes. That's why if we drop a book on the floor and it makes a loud thud, you jump. That's an auditory reflex. So the corpora quadrigemina help us with those reflexes, visual and auditory. They're found on the back side of the midbrain. Down below the midbrain is this bump that we see right here, number 20, this bump. This bump is called the pons. So the pons is the bump that I see here. The biggest thing to know about the pons is that it has what's called the pontine respiratory center. The pontine respiratory center helps you with your breathing rate. So the pontine respiratory center setting our breathing rate, the pons. And down below the pons is a region called the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata. I'm gonna have to type that one. The medulla oblongata also dictates your breathing rate, but it's also really important for things like your heart rate. And it does a lot of reflexes, our favorite reflexes, like coughing and sneezing and vomiting. We can thank the medulla for all of that. So the medulla oblongata, along with the pons and the midbrain, these are the parts of the brain that help you to do basic life functions that keep you alive. Let's briefly go back to one of the structures we had already labeled. So this whole structure here, remember that this whole thing, the brown thing here, this is the cerebellum. The cerebellum. And inside the cerebellum, you can see that white matter. Remember that the white matter was called the Arbor Vitae, the tree of life. One other structure I want to label on this view, but then we're going to explore it a little bit more on a different model. Up above the brain, you can see this blue area. So this area here in blue, this is something called the dural venous sinus. I'm going to type that in. Dural venous sinus. The dural venous sinus is where oxygen poor blood that's leaving the brain gets dumped into. So we find blood up here, all the stuff that's coming out from in between those gyri and sulci. This is where I send it to get it away from the brain. So the dural venous sinus, that's what we're seeing here in the top in blue. To help us understand that dural venous sinus a little bit more though, I want to take us back to this model. So this model is on the page before that big flat one that we just labeled together. And to help us make sense of what even in the world we're looking at in this picture here, I actually want you to look at these pictures with me. I believe you have these pictures in the guided lesson. These pictures are going to help us understand what we're looking at on our model. Up to this point, all of the models that we've looked at, we've sliced the brain like this. So we've always looked when we did a sagittal cut to divide it into left and right. Well, the model that we're looking at now and what we're seeing in these pictures is actually if we did a coronal cut, if we divided it front from back. So when we do a coronal cut, we can see things we couldn't see before. So all of this area here, like it has labeled the brain is made out of gray matter that I see here in kind of this beige color, and the white matter, just like we saw in the cerebellum. So my cerebrum, my big part of the brain, has gray matter and white matter. Remember that that gray matter has bumps and it has indentations. Can you remind me in the chat, when I'm talking about a gyrus, is a gyrus a bump or an indentation? A gyrus. Is a gyrus a bump or an indentation? Do we remember? Exactly. Yep, a gyrus is a bump. So I can see a gyrus right here, and I can see a sulcus right here, where the brain matter has bent down. On the surface of the brain, so touching the gyri and the sulci, we have our first layer of connective tissue, something called the Pia Mater. So the Pia Mater is the deepest layer of connective tissue that surrounds the brain. It's directly attached to the brain. We can see it here in pink, the Pia Mater. Just above the Pia Mater, you can see this seafoam green layer here. The seafoam green layer is called the Arachnoid Mater. The Arachnoid Mater. And the reason the Arachnoid Mater got its name is if we look down in my picture that's down lower, while we have it seafoam green in the other picture, in real life, it actually looks white and stringy because these are all collagen proteins. So the Arachnoid Mater has a lot of collagen proteins that hang down from it, making it look like spider webs, which is why we call it the Arachnoid Mater. The outermost layer of connective tissue that wraps around the brain is something called the Dura Mater. And the Dura Mater is really, really thick. Literally, the word dura means tough. So the Dura Mater is the tough, thick connective tissue that I see in white. It's so thick that in some places it actually splits in half. See how I can see it going two directions here? It's splitting in half. When it splits in half, there's space for that dural venous sinus. So here's that thing we labeled, that blue line that we labeled. The dural venous sinus is a space where the Dura Mater splits in half, and we can put blood in that location. So now that we've used some labeled pictures to talk about these things, let's go through and label our model together. First, let's get our frame of reference. Up here at the top is where I'd find hair. So this outer layer, not that we made you label it, but this outer layer out here is your skin. That's my epithelial tissue on the outside. Immediately below it, we can see the hypodermis layer of your skin where we've got that adipose tissue. So you can see those big adipocytes, those big fat cells. But then we actually get down into our bone tissue, the bones of the skull, the bone tissue. Connected to the bone is my thickest layer of connective tissue. Remember that the thick layer of connective tissue was called the Dura Mater, the Dura Mater. The Dura Mater is so thick that in some places it splits in half, leaving for us this open space. This open space is that thing we labeled before, the dural venous sinus. Except remember, it's not actually open. This space would be filled with blood. So I'm adding some blood here. The dural venous sinus, where I have oxygen poor blood that I'm sending away from my brain. Underneath the Dura Mater, we've got that seafoam green layer. Remember that this one was called the Arachnoid Mater. The Arachnoid Mater. And that one got its name because of all the little spider webs. So see those little spider webs hanging down. I actually have a name for the space where I find those spider webs. So these open spaces, it's underneath the Arachnoid Mater where the spider webs are found. This is called the Subarachnoid Space. And I'm going to type that for us. The Subarachnoid Space. The subarachnoid space is filled with a kind of fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is the fluid that goes inside the brain and outside the brain and around the spinal cord. So the place where I keep that cerebrospinal fluid is the subarachnoid space, which means it's underneath the Arachnoid Mater. My last connective tissue layer is this thin pink one that we see right here. That last layer that's touching the brain is called the Pia Mater, the Pia Mater. So the Pia Mater is directly attached to the brain tissue. I would, if we're labeling on our model, where the cerebrum is, that's this brain tissue that I see down here, the cerebrum. Is that all the labels we have on our list? Was there anything that I missed on this model, or did we catch it all? Okay, so we need to talk about the gyrus and the sulcus. So again, which of those words, was it a gyrus or was it a sulcus that meant a bump? G or S, gyrus or sulcus, which one is a bump? Yeah, exactly, a gyrus. So gyrus G, a gyrus would be this bump that I see right here, or I've got another bump right here, that's another gyrus, got another bump right here, another gyrus. So the gyri are any of the bumps that we see. A sulcus is an indentation. So these spaces here where we're indenting, and I'm actually going to color it in yellow to make sure we can see. See, I've got this open space between the parts of my brain. That's the sulcus. That's the indentation. So gyrus always means bump. Sulcus always means an indentation. I know I had seen a message or a note earlier about where the bone tissue was found on this model. That bone tissue is found right here. So I guess it's labeled region number 6. So we can see, not that it's super clear, but this would be compact bone on the outside because there's no space in it. And then I've got some spongy bone here in the middle and some compact bone on the inside as well. So my bone connective tissue is all the stuff that we see in this region here. So the one other thing I want to make sure we label on this model here is that white, thick connective tissue layer that we saw forming the dural venous sinus. That white that I see on either sides of the blood vessel, that's the Dura Mater. The Dura Mater is that white on either side of the blood vessel. I believe you have on your list bone connective tissue. The bone connective tissue that we see here is just the bone of the skull, like we labeled on the other model. So I've got bone connective tissue here. I've got it all over the place. To be honest with you, I'm not certain that we'll actually ask you that question, but it's a good frame of reference to know where we can find that tissue. Any questions about this model? Or shoot me a thumbs up or an emoji if you're good on this model. Perfect. Getting several thumbs up. All right, well, that is the end of our brain stuff for the week. So the first homework assignment for this week for lab is just this brain stuff. If you want to go through and practice this over and over and over, remember, I do not keep any of your scores except your highest score. So use it as a study tool. And remember, like we talked about too, we need to get to the point where we can answer these questions without our notes. So use your notes to get your full credit, but then go back and start quizzing yourself without those notes, because when we take our quizzes, we will not get notes for that. So first set of content related to our brain stuff, complete. Let's dive into bones and bone markings. I want to start by pointing out that we have 1, 2, 3 kinds of foramen when we're looking at skull bone markings. Does anyone happen to remember which of my groups of markings or which kind of markings a foramen was? What kind of bone marking was a foramen? Yeah, a couple of us chiming in. That word foramen always means a hole. So notice that this week we've got a supraorbital foramen and an infraorbital foramen. Supra means superior. It means above. Infra means inferior, below. So my supraorbital foramen is above my orbit, which is my eye socket. Here's my supraorbital foramen, the hole above the eye. I also have a hole down below it though. So the infraorbital foramen down below the orbit. But those are both very different from my mental foramen that I see down in the mental region, which was by the chin. So just like we did with the muscles, use the names of the bone markings to help you find where they're located. I also want to mention the one other hole that we see on this particular slide is that thing called the external acoustic meatus. I'm going to underline that one. Actually, I'll put an arrow next to it. The external acoustic meatus. If we put that in easy words, it's the outside hearing hole, external acoustic meatus that we see there. Close to the external acoustic meatus, you can see this massive thing that hangs down. This massive thing that hangs down is called the mastoid process. The mastoid process. In front of the mastoid process is a smaller thing that hangs down. The smaller thing that hangs down is called the styloid process. Styloid process. Styloid like a stylus that you would use to write on your tablet, for example. I'll also point out while we are on this page that it takes two bones to make up your cheekbones. So what you see as the cheekbone is actually made from two different bones. The one in the front is called the zygomatic bone, and the one that's behind it is the temporal bone. When I'm talking about the two parts of your cheekbone, they have kind of funky names. So let me get colored here. The front part of your cheekbone that we see. The front part of the cheekbone is something called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. When we look at the back part of your cheekbone, the back part of your cheekbone is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. The best way to remember is whatever bone I'm attaching to, whatever I'm reaching out toward, that's the name of the process. So when I'm on the temporal bone and I'm reaching toward the zygomatic bone, I'm called the zygomatic process. When I'm on the zygomatic bone and I'm reaching out to the temporal bone, I'm called the temporal process. So keep those in mind, even though it's kind of backwards. If you're thinking about who am I attaching to, that's going to help you with it. A couple other markings I want to point out to you are these, the sutures. Hey, can you remind me? This is way back, week number 1. We talked about suture joints. Were suture joints one that did or did not move? Suture joints do or do not move when we have a suture. Yeah, exactly. The sutures do not move. So non-moving attachment sites between the skull bones in an adult. We don't want your brain to be getting pounded with bones up here. So we've got sutures to hold it together and we don't move. The first suture is named just like the plane that it looks like. So this suture up here is called the coronal suture. The coronal suture, just like a coronal plane. That's the direction that it goes in. Next to it, we've got this squiggly one here on the side. The squiggly one here on the side is called the squamous suture. The squamous suture here on the side. And in the very back, we have what's called the lambdoid suture. The lambdoid suture. As you're learning these sutures, it's important to know which bones they're in between. So the coronal suture is between my frontal bone and my parietal bone. The squamous suture is between my parietal bone and my temporal bone. And the lambdoid suture is between the parietal bone and the occipital bone here in the back. Because if I know what they're between, I'm able to say, hey, even though I don't see a lot of it, this suture is between the frontal bone and the parietal bone. This must be the coronal suture. So we can't see it super clearly, but we know what bones are by it. That helps us to find things. I had seen a question earlier in the chat asking, I presume it was asking about this purple thing. Is that correct? This purple thing right here? Yes. Okay, so this purple thing is the purple thing that's named after the bone it's attaching to. So this purple thing is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. The zygomatic process of the temporal bone. All right, let's turn the skull around. Now we're looking on the back side. In the back side, we can see my one last suture that we had not seen before. And this is another one that's named like those body planes. So this one right here that we're looking at is the sagittal suture. The sagittal suture, just like a mid-sagittal plane would cut right in the middle. Sagittal suture. We can also see underneath it, this one here, that is the lambdoid suture. The lambdoid suture. And we can see a little bit of that squamous suture on the side. A little bit of the squamous suture on the side. We also see a large bone marking right here. This is something that sticks out from the back of the skull. You can actually kind of feel it on the back of your head. This is called the external occipital protuberance. External occipital protuberance. And this is really important for attaching muscles that we see in the back. The external occipital protuberance, as well as this line that I see right here. This line that I see right here is called the superior nuchal line. The superior nuchal line. Again, very important for muscle attachment to help you pull your head backwards. The superior nuchal line. When I go to the internal view, there is a bone that we hadn't met yet because it's one that's mostly seen on the inside. So this one here in the middle that kind of either looks like a bat or a butterfly or something weird. This bone here is called the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone. Couple of important bone markings in the sphenoid bone. First are these two holes that I see right here. These two holes are called the optic canals. The optic canals. This is a space for the optic nerve to leave the brain and go out into the eyeballs, the optic canals. The other important bone marking is this indentation that we see right here. This indentation is called the Cela Turcica. If I looked at it from the side to help you understand it better, it would look like this. So here's the Cela Turcica. It's an indentation in the sphenoid bone. The Cela Turcica is the special home for the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland lives inside the Cela Turcica, inside that indentation. If we go in front of the sphenoid bone, you can see all of these little spots. See all the little spots that are up here? These are things called the cribriform foramina. Cribriform foramina, remember that word foramen or foramina, that's more than one, means holes. So all of these little polka dots are holes where neurons go from your cranial cavity down into your nose to help you with the process of smell. So the cribriform foramina, little holes for the olfactory neurons to go down. And dividing the left side and the right side is something that sticks straight up. So this thing I'm going to color on top of it. This thing right here is called the crista galli. So it's a piece of bone that sticks straight up in between the two halves of the cribriform foramina, the crista galli, sticking straight up. One other bone marking that I'll mention for you here inside the skull is this right here. This is called the Foramen Magnum. Foramen Magnum literally means big hole. So the Foramen Magnum is a big hole in the bottom of the skull. Can you help me out in the chat? Can we take a guess at what we think might be found in the middle of the Foramen Magnum? What might I find inside this big hole right here? The Foramen Magnum. Yeah, several of us are chiming in. What I would find hanging down in here, parts of that brain stem, like Hayden was mentioning, so things like the medulla oblongata, or maybe part of the pons, but I would also definitely see the spinal cord. See, we can't see the foramen magnum in my picture over here on the side, but I'm pretending to draw on some vertebrae that would be right underneath it. The spinal cord hangs down in the middle of this, so it leaves the skull using the foramen magnum. One more view of the skull, and this is the bottom side. We already talked about the big foramen magnum, the big hole. Right next to the hole are a couple of things that stick out. These things that are sticking out that we see right here, these are called the occipital condyles. Occipital condyles. The occipital condyles sit right on top of your vertebrae and allow you to rock your head forward and backwards. The occipital condyles. So we see those right next to the foramen magnum. We can also see the little things that stick up. So remember that the little one that sticks up was called the styloid process. And the big one that sticks up, that's called the mastoid process, the massive one. You can also see next to the styloid process, there's a big indentation right here. This is a big divot right here. This big indentation that we're seeing right here is called the mandibular fossa. The mandibular fossa. A fossa was something that was an indentation or something that goes down. The mandibular fossa. The mandible rests right up in there. When your jaw opens and closes, we actually have rotation in the mandibular fossa. So that's part of what we call the temporal mandibular joint. Oh, I got some sound coming through. Make sure you're muted for me. Do me a favor. So the mandibular fossa helping us with moving our jaw forward and backwards. That, I'm going to move us on to muscles. I'll remind you that any of the bone markings you did not get labeled, they'll be labeled in the guided lesson, and you can also find them if you do a Google Images search. There's lots of pictures out there. So we're going to move into muscles. With the muscles of the face, there's not very many of them. That's good news for us. And many of them are named based on where I find them, which makes it easy. So for example, the frontalis muscle is found right on top of the frontal bone. So the frontalis muscles in your forehead. This is what's going to allow you to move your eyebrows up. On the side of the face, we've got the temporalis muscle on top of the temporal bone. We have two orbicularis muscles. Orbicularis meant something that made a circle. So when we're talking about the circle around the eyes, orbicularis oculi is my circle around the eyes, orbicularis oculi. And my circle around the mouth is called orbicularis oris. Oris for the mouth, orbicularis oris. The other muscle that's attached directly to the mouth, you can see it here, number 5. And I can see it over here as well. This is called Zygomaticus Major. Zygomaticus Major is the muscle that helps you to smile. Zygomaticus Major. So big number 5, and also we can see it over here, Zygomaticus Major. The other face muscle for us to know is this one right here that's hidden under your salivary gland. We can also see it over here on the side of the face. This muscle that we see hanging down is called the masseter. The masseter. So my last muscle of the face, the masseter. One of my students earlier this week reminded me that the technical word for chewing is mastication. So the masseter helps us with mastication, which is chewing. The one other muscle we're learning this week, we talked about it in our muscle naming, called the Sternocleidomastoid Muscle. The Sternocleidomastoid Muscle attaches to the sternum, the clavicle, and the mastoid process. So the sternum, the clavicle, and the mastoid process would be up higher. We can't really see it. This muscle right here is my sternocleidomastoid. Sternocleidomastoid. And if I look at my view over here, my sternum would be down here, my clavicle's right here, and my mastoid process is at the top. Sternocleidomastoid. This one right here. Any questions about face muscles? Is anyone still listening? There's a better question. Do I have any friends left? Sebastian's here. Perfect. Jessica, Hayden, I got some friends. We're just not totally sure if we want to comment on the face muscles, right? Yeah, Max says this seems simple enough. Yeah, compared to last week especially, right? It's much easier than last week was. So that's good. Since we don't have as many muscles this week, we don't have as many functions to know either, which means that if you do like to make flashcards, this week would be a good week for flashcards. We can do flashcards on this stuff. So let's go through and talk about the main functions of our facial muscles. So we'll start with the one that elevates the eyebrows, raises your eyebrows. This one is called frontalis. That's the one that lives on top of the eyebrows. When it pulls on them, it pulls them up. When we want to pull them down, or when we want to close our eyelids, we use one of our circle muscles. We use the other circle muscle to close our lips. Can you remind me, when I'm talking about orbicularis oris, is that closing the eyes or closing the lips? Orbicularis oris. Eyes or lips? Yeah, exactly. That's going to be closing my mouth or closing my lips. So orbicularis oris, oris for the oral region, helping me to close the lips. Orbicularis oculi for the ocular region, for the eyes. When we talk about moving the mandible, which is your jawbone, there are two muscles that we use to help us move it up and down, which is what elevation is, moving it up. So the first one is the one that we talked about with chewing, the masseter. The second one that helps us to raise the jawbone, to elevate the mandible, is actually temporalis. The fact that it lives back on the side of your face and attaches down there, it can pull it up. In addition to pulling it up, it also pulls it backwards. So when we talk about retracting the jaw, pulling the jaw backwards, that's the job of temporalis, pulling it backwards. So again, not very many functions we have to know this week. These are functions we'll just have to memorize. But I really think, especially after all the work we had to put in last week, this week's going to be a breeze in that regard. Just one more activity I'm going to do with you before our group work, and this is that origin and insertion activity. So I'm going to get out my colors so we can color code things together. Can you remind me in the chat, is it the origin O or the insertion I that moves when a muscle contracts? Origin O or insertion I, who's moving when a muscle contracts? Exactly. Yep. Who's moving when I contract is the insertion. The insertion always moves toward the origin. So we're going to do some work on the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Remember that the sternocleidomastoid muscle was named based on all the places it attaches to. So now we're going to look at which of those are the moving places, which of those are the not moving places. So let's start with our origin. I haven't had enough coffee, so help me out. The origin does or does not move? These origin attachment sites, are these going to be the ones that move? Yeah, these are the ones that do not move. So when I look at the sternocleidomastoid muscles, the first parts of its name, the sterno part and the clavicle part of its name, these are the places where I attach that do not move. So let's find the manubrium of the sternum. Quick refresher, the manubrium's at the top of the sternum. Then we've got the body of the sternum. And remember at the very bottom was that xiphoid process. So the sternocleidomastoid attaches to the manubrium, that's the top. It also attaches to the clavicle. There's the clavicle. Those are my origins, the ones that you just told me do not move when a muscle contracts. Now I'm going to look at the insertions, the ones that do move. The insertion of the sternocleidomastoid is the mastoid process, the last part of its name. So remember that mastoid process was the big one in the back, the mastoid process. So when I do the process of contraction, I'm going to use my muscle that I'm adding on here. I'm going to use my muscle fibers to pull my insertion toward my origin. Now, your body has two sternocleidomastoids. So you can feel their general location. The mastoid process is kind of down behind your ear. And we've got the sternum and the clavicle here in the front. When I move my two mastoid processes toward my sternum and clavicle, when I do this, I am making the angle or the distance between my head and the sternum and the clavicle, I'm making that distance smaller. The angle is decreasing. When the angle decreases, is that flexion or extension? When an angle decreases. Yeah, exactly. When my angle decreases, that's flexion, when I bring things closer together. So if both of my sternocleidomastoids are both pulling my head to bring it closer, my whole head is going to flex. It's going to go toward the front. But I can also just contract one of them. I can also just bring this mastoid process close to the sternum and the clavicle. And when I bring just this one closer, my head goes like this. When my head turns like this, that's rotation. So depending on whether both of my sternocleidomastoids contract or just one of them, I will either do rotation or I'll do flexion toward the front. So in addition to those functions that we were learning, that we matched up on here, make sure we're also learning our functions of the sternocleidomastoid. Whether we're talking about one side or two sides, what kind of actions we do. That's all I've got. In the chat, shoot me an emoji or a GIF. How do we feel? And if you have any questions, I want to give you a chance to put those questions in as well. I'm working on grabbing that group work for us. I love it, Sebastian. That's a great GIF. Sebastian is just loving what we talked about this week. All right. Yeah, still processing, Victor. I get that. I like it. All right. Well, I'm going to put here in the chat for us the link to our group activity. In a moment, I'm going to open up those groups. Remember that only one person in your group submits the form, but everyone in your group might want to have it up so you can track along with the questions. When you're done with the group activity, that's all we've got for lab today. Remember that we are doing in-person lecture, so we will start at 2 o'clock with some group work to review the stuff to get us ready for today's quiz, and then we'll cover as much of lesson number 9 as we can. So I'm going to turn off that recording and open up those groups.